Good morning, everyone. It's 10 a.m. on a Thursday morning. It's kind of frosty. I be honest, I'm really, hey, Chris and Emily, hopefully is there as well. I have to be honest, I love staying at home when it's really cold. Hi. So hopefully we're going to see a few more folks coming in over the next few minutes. Um, just realized I had, I put video of our meeting that hadn't even happened rather than link to. So I kind of panicked. I left a scar on my heart, but I got to see sort it out. So everything's all good. Um, what I'd like to do today is have something a little slightly more structured, because in going through rewrites for the book, I'm sort of to think of, I could pursue this, pursue that. One of the issues with the SI is, as you can see, they're kind of all over the place on many different topics. But one in particular that is of interest to me is their ideas on language, the particular ideas on the way language functions in a society that is increasingly closing off alternatives and alternative definitions of words, which is why they really have a passion for poetry, maybe not specific poets, but certainly poetry in the sense of how it functions as opening up a kind of an empty room or empty space that is there for the taking, for the defining and so on. So kind of that's the gist of the ideas we want to present for today. Now, what I've done is my desk is full of books as per usual. We're going to be picking and choosing, but what I wanted to do was sort of organize it so that we can kind of start with a framework of what the symbolists actually thought was a definition of their work. What I'd like to do is have you pay particular attention to the dates, the particular dates in which these things are occurring, because what is unusual is we've got Charles Baudelaire, who passes away in 1867. Lautréamont passes away at a very young age in 1870. And then Rimbaud manages to last to 40-ish, dies in 1891. But it's not until 1886 that a definition of symbolism even comes into play as a kind of a definition of a genre that, let's say, over the last 40 years took some time to come into being. And so we have poets who are working kind of by themselves. And of course, as with anything else, it takes a period of time and it takes a number of people to do something until it kind of reaches that, the proverbial tipping point where we see that, hey, there's a trend going on. There's something happening here that is combining all these different people together. So that's why I wanted to post the definition or the manifesto. Everybody's got a manifesto. You're not cool without a manifesto. You got to have one, right? So whatever you're doing. So this is the one by Jean Mauriac that published the Manifesto of Symbolism in 1886. Now, as with every other new movement, you got to push aside the old, right? You got to restart. And of course, the same thing is happening here. So Romanticism, having sounded all the tumultuous alarm signals of rebellion, its days of battle and glory over, lost strength and grace, abdicated its heroic audacities, became restrained, skeptical, and full of common sense. In the honorable and tentative narrowness of the Parnassians, now the Parnassians were the next group of poets who were all about, basically to describe them in one line, art for art's sake. A nice turn of phrase, an interesting rhythmic pattern. It was more about form than it was about content. So we have the Romantics who are kind of sounding the alarm, and over time, their ideas become skeptical and sort of people become used to them. So it develops a kind of common sense, an awareness that is sort of obvious. Then we get the Parnassians who try to rescue the content of romantic literature and poetry, and now make it art for art's sake. It sought false revival. Then finally, like the monarch lapsing into childish, it allowed itself to be deposed by naturalism, which to one cannot seriously accord a greater value than that of protest, legitimate but ill-advised protest against the blandness of certain novelists in that fashion. So we're essentially talking about all those, just letting a couple more folks in, those individuals who are trying to do something new with poetry and simply not advancing any kind of social agenda, because we see there's a revolution in language, but not a corresponding revolution in social being, we'll say. Sure enough, da-da-da-da, along comes symbolism, a new manifestation of art that was then awaited, one one necessary and inevitable. So again, there's a degree of necessity that this has to happen, right? Everything happens because of what has happened before. So this necessary and inevitable movement in poetry called symbolism. We have already proposed the name of symbolism as the only term capable of truly designating the present thrust of the creative spirit in art. That name may stand. Well, sure enough, it did. But notice the date, 1886, well after many of the sort of the more important symbolist poets have already passed away. And in fact, Rimbaud is no longer writing at this point either. Oh, sorry, take a break for a sec. They're letting more people in. So we have this unusual configuration of poets who are writing in this new style, sort of in, around, and under the Parnassian field and responding to it. And it takes until the mid 80s before enough is happening that we can recognize a particular pattern. Now, what is quite interesting is the way in which symbolist poetry is described. It's very elusive. It's difficult to pin down. We can certainly think about it, but it has a lot to do with talking about primordial ideas versus clothing them in a particular recognizable fashion. Because as Mauriac writes, the enemy of didacticism, right, pedagogy, education, declamation, false sensibility, and objective description, symbolist or symbolic poetry seeks to clothe the idea with a sensory form, which, nevertheless, should not exist as an end in itself, but as a form. In other words, the idea should stand, it should be the eternal thought, but that ephemeral, contingent, fleeting image, that's the gist of poetry, right? That's the kernel of poetry. So certainly Baudelaire had mentioned that in his writing, The Painter of Modern Life. So we have this idea that is closed in sensory form, but should not exist as an end in itself, but as a form which, though serving at all times to express the idea, must remain subjective. The idea in its turn must not be allowed to be deprived of the sumptuous robes of external analogy, for the essential character of symbolic art consists in its never leading to the concentration of the idea in itself. So we have the presentation of an idea in contingent, fleeting garb, whatever the content may be, and it really is up to the reader to decipher this sort of fleeting, ephemeral vision that we have to try to make sense of what's really being discussed. So it is a way for poets to talk about ideas that can be couched in certain ways. Therein lies the possibility of speaking about revolution and revolutionary thoughts in this mode that is both contingent and fleeting. So we have these primordial ideas in this art, scenes of nature, the actions of human beings, all concrete phenomena are not there to manifest themselves, but they are sensory appearances intended to represent the esoteric affinity with primordial ideas. So the whole thing is very fleeting, right? It's more almost looking at the contingency of some symbolic poets. And I just wanted to read that out and kind of have it echo throughout all of the work that we look at, because there will be a struggle between these primordial ideas, one of them certainly being freedom, because that is one that is motivating many people. So there is the notion of primordial ideas couched in contingent, fleeting, ephemeral content. So we can read a whole range of different poets, and they could be talking about self-sufficiency, freedom, necessity, and all these kinds of things. Yet at the same time, it's difficult to pin it down, because what's remarkable is when we read these, they often, if we just kind of read them as singular sentences, it's like a montage. It's like a cinematic montage. And it's kind of a cumulative effect that you need to finish the poem and reflect on it before you can understand really what it's ultimately about. So a very interesting and different way to operate. Emily, did you have your hand up a moment ago? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm wondering, like, in your reading of this, what the primordial ideas are, because I see that like right at the beginning. And then he goes on to talk about Pindar and Shakespeare and Dante and Faust and these very like what's the word? Sorry, not enough caffeine in my brain. Very
it's early.
very kind of mythological sources. And so I'm
Mhm.
wondering, is the primordial idea like something like freedom, like you were saying, or is the primordial idea a symbol, as in something like the devil and Faust, etc., which refers to a kind of idea? I'm just wondering what primordial idea really is in your reading, because that was something I wasn't sure about.
Yeah, I think actually in the case of the symbolists, and given the time in which they are writing, I think that what you pointed out, primordial would be things like justice and freedom. Because if we were to be really nasty to both Baudelaire and Rimbaud, you could say that Baudelaire writes about freedom and Rimbaud writes about justice, because he is, and we'll get to specific examples. These two are looking at those concepts as primordial, things that have motivated us throughout history. So primordial in the sense that typically when you talk about mythology and so on, and myth making, we're talking about ideas that, from the ancient past that try to explain natural events. We're past that, right? We've got science taking care of that. But those other primordial ideas like necessity, freedom, and justice, those are things that still matter. In fact, continue to matter more and more over the next, let's say, 150 years. So I would say those primordial ideas are more in relation to things like necessity, justice, and freedom, because they do sort of encapsulate and underline many of the themes that are discussed in symbolist poetry. And for the sake of clarity, I want to sort of just be brief and look at two or three of the important ones. There are many others, but let's say for my taste, Baudelaire, Rimbaud, and L'Autrement are kind of the three main ones. And they're particularly important to the SI, because even Baudelaire, who is about the individual, and again, we'll get to that, the notion of freedom is still in his vocabulary, right? That primordial idea is still informing his position of himself relative to society, because I get the sense that in his writings, he wanted to be accepted by the bourgeoisie, and they made life very difficult for him, because, how many poets do you know that are millionaires, right? It's, make as much money as philosophers. So it became a very difficult sort of venture for him to embark upon, and he ended up being a writer still. He was lucky enough to make his living at that, but it was not easy. So here he is, bitching about the fact that it's difficult to be a poet, let alone a writer, in a capitalist society, because they're not producing things that are commodities, that are things. So he rails against that, but still underlining it is freedom, right? It's a freedom to be, the freedom to do what they want. So I just want to kind of sort of point that out, that their particular version, right? But it comes along very late, right? 1886, at which point symbolist poetry has been around. I mean, the Salon reports from 1848 to 1852, all of Baudelaire stuff. He's gone by 1867, and he's obviously no longer producing. And then Rimbaud shortly after. And although he continues to live as a person, he's no longer writing. So yeah, he's off doing all of his crazy things, his arms dealing and traveling through Africa and India. So it is an interesting way to present what the symbolists were trying to do, which was to talk about these primordial ideas, but to couch them in this kind of contingent language that was very fleeting, which Baudelaire at least gives us kind of a template by which to understand what it is that he's doing, because he does say that, for him, beauty is a combination of what is eternal and what is fleeting, right? We see something that is going, that is a primordial idea in something that is just there. A person walking by a certain color wall, wearing a certain color coat at a certain time of the day, and it's like, oh, it's beautiful, and it's gone, right? And that's what art is. It can be fleeting. So this is kind of what is informing symbolist poetry as a category, as a genre, we'll say, while many of the actual exponents that put it on the map are just no longer working. So I just want to point that out. Now, at this point, I just want to jump to the first of several articles, which is All the King's Men from Guy Debord. And this is my reference book here, Debord, and it's thick. There's a lot of stuff. I just instead of lifting weights, I carry this around all day. It's got a lot of stuff in here. And this is kind of my go-to book to make sure that like translation issues, for example, are clear, because there are words in French that mean different things. Now, I can certainly stand corrected by a French teacher, but I believe French has about a third the number of words than English. So let's say we have 1 million, they've got 350,000 or so. And because of that, it's a very connotative language, right? It can denote certain things, but it is a very rich connotative language in which words can mean different things depending on the context. And I think this is an idea that informs all the King's Men, because Debois says, and again, this is fairly early, 1963, the problem of language is at the heart of all the struggles between the forces striving to abolish the present alienation and those striving to maintain it. So there is a kind of official discourse, what would be like public speech, and then we have the poets and the thinkers that are trying to navigate through this official language. And Debois points out that that is really what the struggle is, right? To articulate what's going on. If you own the means of presentation and own the means of discourse, you kind of have the final say on what language is going to dictate. And what is being described here in this essay is the idea of information, right? Somehow it's an already dead language, right? It's already been formulated to mean something. So he goes on, words work on behalf of the dominant organization of life. Words coexist with power in a relation analogous to that of that which proletariats have with power, right? It is always this contentious relationship. It's a struggle. It's a battle for what words mean. I think that's one of the reasons why we always have a really rich underground of individuals that use language and have words mean different things. An example I can think of right now is, rap culture has been doing that for many years, where they have appropriated certain words, and they're not the only ones, but it's a subculture, a subcategory that appropriates certain words that only mean something to them. Probably one of the best examples, if any of you have ever read Clockwork Orange, Clockwork Orange is about that, right? It's about creating this world that is sort of this weird mixture of, I think, Cockney and Russian, if I remember correctly. Yeah, so it's certain things still stuck in my mind. That's one of them. But it's just a really interesting take on how subcultures can appropriate language in a certain way and have certain words mean something just to them, right? And those that are outside the circle, right, outside the group or the loop, don't know. So you can't communicate with one another. So I think that's kind of what's going on here, because he mentions power, right? And here, power presents only the falsified official sense of words through information. And again, power, and I looked it up, it is pouvoir, and pouvoir in French can mean both the powers that be, as well as power as in strength. So, or Kraft, if you're reading Nietzsche, right, which is another form of power. So power here is both the powers that be have the power to do this. And they present to us as falsified official sense of words. And here again, as early as 1963, we have the beginnings of what will become the spectacle once again. A spectacle of ideas, a spectacle of images, and now a kind of spectacle of language, where words are now co-opted and owned by those that have the means of dissemination, right, of information. So he goes on, we should also understand a phenomenon of the insubordination of words. And herein lies the importance of poetry, because certainly we have every reason to ask, well, why is poetry in particular really necessary to that revolutionary agenda? And he kind of makes it clear here, because there is this idea of the insubordination of words, their desertion or open resistance. And again, insubordination, desertion, or to desert, that military metaphor that begins with Baudelaire in My Heart Laid Bare, and we'll get to that, but it's continued, right? It's a combat. It's a combative stance. It's that space where words are contentious. And then, of course, in brackets, manifested in all modern writings from Baudelaire to the Dadaist and Joyce as a symptom of the general revolutionary crisis of this society. Under the control of power, language always designates something other than authentic experience. Typically, language has a referent, right? We refer to something that is recognizable. So as that gets unmoored and the referent becomes more and more vague and evasive and fleeting, right? In this case, now we have this language that is referring to something that may actually not exist, or is not recognized as the truth. So we have this this contestation, right? This struggle, this combat between the meaning of words, and more important, those that own the means to disseminate that information under the control of power. Okay, it is precisely for this reason that a total contestation is possible. The organization of language has fallen into such confusion that the communication imposed by power is exposing itself as an imposture and a dupery. So again, the notion of a spectacle, we're going to pull back the curtain and see that words are not lining up with their reference very well. An embryonic cybernetic power is vainly trying to put language under the control of the machines it controls in such a way that information would henceforth be the only possible communication. But there is a much more general and radical opposition that is denouncing all unilateral communications, communication that undermines all separate power. Real communication dissolves the state. So if we can communicate really and truly and identify that which is important to us, we can start to break apart that spectacle and break apart this official discourse that you would basically be hearing from, right, in a unilateral one-way kind of communication. Now, where is my book? There is, where'd it go? Jeez. Okay, I was trying to, oh, right there. Okay, I was doing some other work. Those with an art background might recognize this book, Telematic Embrace, which is a really interesting book, Visionary Theories of Art, Technology, and Consciousness. And I'm trying to remember, I was writing something about the dub and Ilbian scene in New York City a couple of years ago, and I was talking about, or thinking about, how DJs and artists could communicate back and forth and pass works back and forth. And somehow this thing just kind of came into my purview, as they say. So in this book, Roy Ascott talks about this other book here, which is The Computerization of Society, a response to the president, or sorry, a report to the president of France. Now, this is a book that came out in 1978 about the internet. Now, I don't remember the internet in 1978. I was around, I was 18. I was more concerned with finishing school. But here is a book that was written about a very sort of, it was a national version of the internet. So this kind of vocabulary, this knowledge, or this unilateral communication, information, cybernetic powers, these ideas were already in the air. I mean, it's 1963. So Debord is already kind of, thinking about, okay, where is this going to go? Now, I'm not saying that he had a crystal ball and envisioned the beginnings of the internet, but it is ironic that the first time we have something that resembles the internet is where? In France. And this happened in the mid to the late 70s. So by 1978, when the original French version came out, I'm going to ignore that phone. When the phone rings and you don't want to answer it and you just kind of get all jittery. So I apologize if I get really upset here. Anyway, what I want to get to is a really interesting passage here. And the writers, in trying to figure out what the internet's going to be all about. And again, keep in mind what Debord is discussing, the ownership of words, the ownership of meaning. So they write on page 9 here, anxiety makes people long for a rational, certain future. Sure, yeah, that sounds good. It increases when profound changes uproot traditional values. That happens on a daily basis. For 100 years now, the most spectacular, ironic choice of words, spectacular transformations of society have been technological basis, which makes it tempting to predict a future controlled by technology itself. At present, this vision is represented by telematics, and now telematics was their fancy word for the internet, and finds expression in contradictory illusions. Now, this would not have sounded out of place in a text by the Situationists had they lasted this long. We have, on the one hand, the pessimists emphasize the risks involved, rising unemployment, social rigidity, the vulgarization of life, interests of the SI. They see computerization as a victory for the impersonal, repetitive nature of tasks and the elimination of jobs. It would solidify the unwieldiness and a hierarchical nature of organizations, right? The bureaucracy of life. So another SI concern, reinforcing the omniscience of those in the know while automizing the others. All that would remain would be the computerizers and the computerized, or the users and the used. So we have that. Then, on the other hand, the optimists believe that miracles are within reach, that computerization means information. This is 1978. And this was the original, this is the 1980 translation, but 78 was when this came out in France. Information means culture, and culture means emancipation and democracy. Anything that increases access to information facilitates dialogue on a more flexible and personal level. So I would argue that had the SI lasted till the late 70s, they would have jumped all over the internet. They would have probably made this a really useful tool. Paishina.
It's Payoshini.
Sorry.
It's okay. I just wanted to ask, so the first sentence in the paragraph that we were just reading in the SI anthology says that under the control of power, language designates something other than authentic experience. And that is why contesting this is possible. What I feel confused about is that on the one hand, there is this all powerful, omnipresent spectacle, which is not just visual stuff, but it's also a certain expression of a mode of production.
Yeah.
And on the other hand, they believe that any authentic expression is possible. So basically, what I'm asking is, wouldn't the spectacle, or isn't the spectacle capable of absorbing contradictions and making that spectacular in turn?
Yes, absolutely. Short answer, yes, because that sort of therein lies the difficulty in trying to fight a particular war with the very tools that are owned by the powers that you're fighting against. And it always reserves the opportunity to expand its definition of tolerance, dissent, subversion. And this is a theme that runs through a lot of the SI writings. The fact that, if they can go after culture, they can go after the kind of the means of production that reproduces the thoughts of that society. So fighting on a cultural level was very important. But there is certainly here, you're absolutely right. Their tendency of the spectacle to absorb resistance. And I mean, Mark Fisher called it, capitalist realism, that it literally was this behemoth that could subsume so many things. That was always the inherent problem. They had to create something in such a way that it would be co-opted much more sort of not as easily, because they saw what had happened with data. They saw what happened with surrealism. They realized that that the bourgeois sort of capitalist system had that capacity, right? They could expand and contract at will and absorb this form of resistance. And like, for example, Emily wearing her Sex Pistols t-shirt, when they first came out, I remember taking an album to a party. I almost had my legs broken. I mean, that's how bad it was. And that was 1978. And we got out of there in time. I grabbed my album and got the hell out. I mean, that's how bad it was. It's like, for crying out loud, it's just power pop. Come on. But at that time, it was considered like terrifying. Of course, I'm playing this in a room that, they wanted to listen to the Eagles, and I did it intentionally, but I live to tell. Not something anyone should do in 1978, but what I'm getting at, Paishini, is the ability of capitalism to absorb a tremendous amount of radical behavior. And it does it by commodifying it. And the SI were aware that there was always that possibility of whatever they presented, whatever they yielded up as resistance, would then simply be turned around and bought and sold, right? It was commodified and the edges shaved off. So you're right, it was a struggle for sure. Emily.
Yeah, also because I like throwing myself under the bus. I bought this shirt when I had, honest to God, never listened to the Sex Pistols, and now I have a bit, and actually they're great. But when I bought this, I was in high school. I've had it for a long time, and I bought it because I saw a photograph of someone wearing it and thought, oh my God, she looks so cool, and that's why I bought it. So just to throw myself under the bus, that's totally like the co-option of capitalism, right?
Yeah.
I also just wanted to throw in that I wonder if other people are suspicious of this language of authenticity that kind of follows the SI. I kind of was just writing down like what you said, Edward, about them. What did I write? That language that is sort of under capitalist control can't express authenticity. Like, I'm wondering, maybe in the 1960s, it still seems like authenticity is something you can even talk about, but actually I'm suspicious that it was even true then, or just like, authenticity seems like it seems like this pure utopic kind of idea. And I'm not sure that we can even like talk about authenticity,
Yeah.
at least in 2021. So yeah, I'm interested in that because it seems to be kind of the same thing with alienation, like the SI writing that they want to abolish alienation. Well, like, I don't know if you can abolish alienation. Maybe you
Yeah.
can just have better forms of alienation
Yeah,
that are less alienating.
exactly. We can deal with it a little bit more easily. Now, Judith, did you want to add something? And then we can sort of look at that in its totality. Go ahead.
Yeah, that point that Emily made about authenticity is interesting, and I have thoughts on it. But instead, this is what I'm going to add. In like the year 2002, I spent the summer in London, England, and I worked in a cafe in a really wealthy part of London. And one of our regular clients was Jonesy from the Sex Pistols. So he was
really Steve Jones.
Like, yeah, Steve Jones.
Yeah.
But his pals called him Jonesy, and I served him like fancy muesli and coffee every day. I also served Kylie Minogue at that same cafe, and that's what I want to contribute.
Cool. Now, I happened to meet Steve Jones and Paul Cook, who started a band after the Pistols. So we're gonna divert here for a moment. They actually played here in London under a band called The Professionals, and there was a bar. It's now what is it called now? It was the Galleria at one point. Now it's just basically the downtown mall. There was a bar called Freifocals, which was the place for good bands. They literally blew the roof off that place. People were standing on tables, literally drinking out of pitchers. It was insane. And I happen to know the members of the band that opened for them, the Zealots. So we heard, hey, they're over at the so-and-so's place. So we rush over there and we talked to them. They were super approachable. I don't know if they were telling me the truth, but they were actually surprised we'd even heard of them. I'm like, for crying out loud, please. Like, so they were humbled, and they were really surprised that we'd even heard of them, that we had even known what they had done. And my friend, whose nickname is Pure Pop, we looked at each other, seriously? Like, wow. So yeah, it's kind of cool. They're just regular folks, right? They're regular people. But I'm glad, Emily, you're not wearing it ironically, that the way some people wear Rush t-shirts ironically. It's like, come on. So you're going to do something. I mean, I could wear my Swans t-shirt here and go, look, right? But anyway, the point we're going to.
If you're wearing a Rush t-shirt, you have to be wearing it ironically.
Really, that's true. Yeah. It's just, that's the way that fashion works. Paishini, did you want to add anything to this?
Yeah.
And then we're going to get back to the
really
notion of
sorry.
authenticity. Yeah.
Just to add to what Emily said about the authenticity, that's precisely why I had that particular question about the spectacle, because I'm probably making this point for the nth time in this class. But again, there's this paradoxy of strategies, you can say, because on the one hand, they're positing this self-consistent subject whose authentic expression has been, he's been deprived of it.
Mhm.
And then on the other hand, communication or language, etc., is supposed to be revolutionary or, adequate and resisting capitalism only when its form is radical enough.
Mhm.
So, yeah.
Now, again, to tie in what you've said to what both Emily and Judith have said, there is that issue of authenticity and truth and reality and so on, that through the very vehicle of language, we already are alienated from the thing itself, are we not? So we are not, it's short of driving around with a wheelbarrow full of things that you plan to talk about that day, and you can just hold them up. We have already alienated ourselves from the reality in which we live, simply because the only means by which we can communicate our experience is through language, and then secondly through images. So to Emily's point, I think it would be virtually impossible to overcome the kind of alienation that is simply part and parcel of existing in a society. I think to feel a degree of alienation is probably healthy, right? It's when we create things, I mean, we put it out there. I don't know if any of you are musicians, but if I compose something and I put it out there, or a film or something, it's no longer mine. And everybody comes at it with their own, emotional luggage, and it's a story about a kid and this, and sure, okay. It's just, that's what art is, right? Art communicates. It meant something to me. and now I've got to give it up. So the notion of authenticity becomes very difficult to pin down. I think just the very nature of expression, right? You're not there with me expressing or feeling that same emotion. I'm now going to try to find the words, right, in this vocabulary of a million words, if I'm writing in English, that will best describe what this feeling is. But already, by virtue of me using these words, it's already alienating. Now, it's the degree to which alienation is controlling your life that becomes the more important issue. To abolish it, I think is impossible. But I think to contest it, to find ways around it, to reconcile that disconnect between reality and our existence, that is certainly worthy. But you're right. It is something that ultimately is just there. It's part of discourse. It's part of, whether it's visual or or spoken discourse. We cannot truly directly experience. I mean, I sound like a Kantian here, right? No, the thing in itself. The thing in itself is really kind of that thing that is always going to be external to us. We will not ever know it, but we can spend all day describing it, and we get a pretty good idea. So yes, there is that utopian moment, Paishini, that you talk about, that is there, and it's the way in which they go about articulating and expressing that possibility of that utopian future, or at least a utopian present, in trying to reconcile and narrow that gap between existence and experience and speech or words or images. But as I say, it's almost essentially built right in. It's just really the way that we live. It's how we deal with it, right? When you work in a factory, when I made cornflakes, once they got dumped out of the cooker, bye-bye. They were somebody else's problem. Now, if I screwed up, it was my problem. But generally speaking, I mean, there's nothing like reading Marx, Capital One, while working in the factory. It kind of comes home, right? And you kind of understand, because it's true. And it doesn't matter what you're doing. At one point, you do feel a sense of alienation. It's out of your hands. So whether it's a creative thing that you feel very strongly about, a piece of art, a poem, a piece of music, whatever, that degree of alienation is still there. It's now gone. But you have completed it. The difference is you've had a hand in creating all of it, right? And so you look at it and say, well, I created that, as opposed to myself and several other people down the line did. Judith.
Yeah, I mean, I guess just like thinking about theory and the history of theory into the late 60s, that is like the transitional moment, or an important transitional moment when thinking about notions of authenticity. So it is in the late 60s that like a slew of integral texts, and especially in France, come out and kind of initiate the transition into postmodern and deconstructionist thought. So that is kind of the moment. Like in the 60s, it's so fraught because there's the remnants of a certain kind of nostalgia and the ability to try to still speak about regaining authenticity, and using Marxist thought to those ends. Like maybe there's something we can reclaim, or maybe there's something utopian and essentialist we can still attain in our society. But then simultaneously, there's like this ripping happening, and all the other theories, like the way Foucauldian theory, the way Derridian theory, the way Deleuzian theory are going to come in, is to resist the need to search for authenticity. Like meaning is not going to be fixed. Essential meaning is not going to be important anymore. And instead, it's just going to be like this interaction of ideas and the historicization of different forms of power structures that are going to move theory away from looking for that authenticity. So I think it's like a really fraught moment in terms of what the authentic might be.
Yeah, and also too, as we had mentioned a couple of weeks ago, the fact that the SI sit on the cusp between modernism and postmodernism, and of all the things that you've just discussed, but also under the throes of structuralism becoming post-structuralism towards the tail end of the 60s. It seems as if more people than simply the SI came to that realization that agency may have something to do with authenticity. If you're going to spend 10 years in academics just talking about cultural codes and structures, and the agent is literally missing. I mean, structuralists, and I can go on at length about structuralism because my schooling in film studies in the 80s in Montreal, as you can imagine, was all structuralism. And I embraced it. I went, oh yeah, look at this code here and this and that. And ultimately, it didn't matter who made the film. Ultimately, it didn't matter who the author of the film was. It was me sitting here looking for patterns and structures and cultural codes and connections and parallels. And I could have been looking at anything, you know, a 30-second commercial or the rules of the game by Jean Renoir. It didn't matter. Suddenly agency and authorship became irrelevant. And I think the SI, along with many of the other people you pointed out, came to the realization that structuralism was essentially a dead end. And even one of the highest exponents of structuralism, Roland Barthes, was one of the first to turn that corner and say, yeah, we're kind of missing an important component, the author. Because I mean, this is the guy who said the author's dead, right? 0 degrees of writing, right? And so that was what we had to be careful of. By the end of that same period, suddenly agency and authenticity were the order of the game, and post-structuralism was born. Judith.
Yeah, I think that just kind of like initiates a series of questions about where we want to position thinking about authenticity.
Mm-hmm.
So there is the authenticity of the agent, the authenticity of the subject, the individual. Perhaps it's the artist, perhaps it's the writer, even perhaps it's the interpreter or the proletariat man. Like there's that desire for authenticity of action. But then there's also the question of a search for truth, like a search for authenticity of meaning. Can we locate in philosophy and philosophical thought something authentic and something real? So I think they're kind of like there's two separate tracks to sort of explore there. And Debord is an interesting figure for trying to think about that, because clearly, like, he thinks of himself as authentic, right? Like that's kind of an inarguable part of his identity. Is like he represents the center of a theoretical movement, and he would say he was authentic. Like this is not like someone who is inauthentic. But then I wonder whether, I just wonder how that like translates into his theory. And
well, it's true. I mean, he did walk the talk, right? As we say now, which is important because it becomes kind of difficult. In fact, this is one of the comments that he made about sociologists when we talked last week about everyday life. Sociologists don't talk about it because this is not something that concerns them. They're busy in their ivory towers writing their papers on sociological formations, and it's just not something they see. Debord, on the other hand, being sort of, practically a street urchin and living on the streets, this is his reality. And so he very much is that singular soul that is going to, push it back out into the mainstream and say, you need to consider the everyday. You need to consider agency and subjectivity. What is interesting is how early he's doing this, how early all of them are doing this, because the readings for this week, I wanted to sort of show and highlight the rest of the group. This is one of the things in the book I wanted to do was say, the SI was not just Guy Debord. It was Raoul Vanigam, René Vinet, Mustafa Kayati, and all of these really were thinking along the same lines. But you're right. I think eventually Debord may have actually got the better of himself and was this sort of lone wolf because he just kept pushing people out of the group. This kind of sort of theoretical rigor and purity. Sure, that's possible, but wow, he literally alienated all the people that were saying essentially the same thing as he was. So in that sense, he's very much a kind of Baudelaire figure who he himself and most of the symbolists saw themselves as singular, right? They were able to rise above the masses. And that's why you see things by Baudelaire where he really trashes the bourgeoisie for just being, petty or easily duped. I'm better than this. There's a little bit of that in Debord as well, that he's not going to fall for these games and he's going to point them out as what they are, and engages in this very combative militaristic language intentionally, because for him, it's a struggle, right? It's a struggle against co-opting virtually everything, including my ability to speak, right? You don't own the meaning of this word. You don't own our language. And so there's a lot at stake, but I think there is certainly the view that he had of himself as an individual that kind of was seeing things that were not viewed as well or as easily by other people. I just want to finish with what is really interesting in this book in 1978 on what was called telematics, became the internet. This dream and this nightmare, and they continue, at least share the same questions. Are we headed, regardless of appearance and alibis, towards a society that will use this new technology to reinforce the mechanisms of rigidity, authority, and domination? Or, on the other hand, will we know how to enhance adaptability, freedom, and communication in such a way that every citizen and every group can be responsible to itself? Kind of sounds mildly anarchistic, self-management and so on, which is kind of cool. So finally they say, in fact, no technology, however innovative it may be, has long-term fatal consequences. The development of society determines its effects rather than being constrained by them. It so happens that in the years to come, 1978, the primary challenge will no longer involve the ability of the more advanced human societies to control nature. This has already been acquired. The challenge instead lies in the difficulty of building the system of connections that will allow information and social organizations to progress together. Under certain conditions, computerization can facilitate this development. So ultimately, what are the names? Simon Nora and Alain Mink have a somewhat positive view of this telematic, the telematic embrace is what it was known as, the fact that you can embrace the rest of the country and communicate to one another. This, like just the language, I mean, this was an official document. Like this was asked by the government of France, like, could you produce this for us? This wasn't like a dissertation paper. This was actually a public discourse. Like this was put out by Telematic. Anyway, so it came out. Yes, a letter to the Inspector General of Finances. That was the person that specifically ordered it, probably to see if there's economic gains to be made in it. Sure, but 1978. This is the tail end of the early 70s. The SI are gone, but the same issues are coming up. Who will control the discourse? Who will control the distribution and dissemination of words and meaning? How do we communicate with one another? If we do through this new telematic thing, that was what they had at the time, what's that going to look like, right? Will it enforce rigidity or will it break it free? So I wanted to point this out mainly because the same concerns are there, right? Whether it's the early 60s or the late 70s, the same concerns are there about changes, technological changes affecting individuals in certain ways. So it is certainly in that text, and that's why there's sort of cybernetic power, information, communication. Again, that telematic thing is not even around, but there's already this thought that, okay, is this where we're going? Is it going to get to that point? And the antidote here is rediscovering poetry, which may merge with reinventing revolution, as has been demonstrated by certain phases in the Mexican, Cuban, and Congolese revolution on page 150. So we have revolutions that are going on in the real world in real time. The Cuban revolution has been a success. And so there is probably the belief that if we push hard enough, we could make this happen. Because again, we need to always contextualize and historicize these ideas. That's why I'm a real stickler for dates. And so the fact that the Mexican Revolution, the Cuban was somewhat of a success. The Algerian War is now over and it's been somewhat of a success. Bloodshed, yes, but still a success. That which needed to be done was accomplished. So certainly in the air, all the concerns that Judith had pointed out, as well as the possibility that there's going to be success to some degree in revolutionary thought. So he carries on. One thing that we can be sure of is that fake, officially tolerated poetry is no longer the poetic adventure of its era. Thus, whereas surrealism in its heyday and its assault against oppressive order of culture and the daily life could appropriately define its arsenal as poetry without poems if necessary, for the SI, it is now a matter of a poetry necessarily without poems. What we say about poetry has nothing to do with the retarded reactionaries of some neo-versification, wow, even one based on the least antiquated modernistic forms. Realizing poetry means nothing less than simultaneously and inseparably creating events and their language. So to speak poetically doesn't necessarily have to involve writing poetry, but to think poetically, think connotatively, think richly, and express richly. Now, again here, because of the joy of staying at home and having a truckload of books around, this is a passage from a book written in 1945 by Henry Miller, the American writer and playwright, writer and novelist. He wrote a book on Rimbaud called The Time of the Assassins. And he writes on page 83 of his book, and again, we're going to talk about Rimbaud, but what I wanted to point out was this notion of, what does poetry without poems look like? And this is what Henry Miller's take in 1945 was like. He says, in a sense, Rimbaud's whole life may be said to be a search for the proper discipline, one to be sure, which would give him freedom. In the beginning, as innovator, this is obvious enough, even though one may quarrel with the sort of discipline which he imposed upon himself. In the second half of his life, when he had broken with society, the purpose of his Spartan discipline was more obscure. So that was one. But the more important one here is this page here. This is like a couple pages later. So what Rimbaud's imitators, as well as his detractors, failed to see is that he was advocating the practice of a new way of life. Sound familiar? Okay, he was not trying to set up a new school of art in order to divert the enfeebled spinners of words. He was pointing out the union between art and life, bridging the schism, healing the mortal wound. So alienation to some poets was a kind of mortal wound that needed to be closed or at least reconciled and healed in some way. And the way Rimbaud looked at it was possibly through that connotative richness that poetry can give us. And I think the same kind of thing is happening here with Debord, as he talks about, realizing poetry meaning nothing less than creating events and their language. So we create an event, we articulate it in the language that we see fit, not the official discourse, not the definitions in a book. All of these things are the tools that the SI are going to use to create those very situations. So he carries on at 150. The point is not to put poetry at the service of revolution, but to put revolution at the service of poetry. So one of these kind of Marxian shifts, and Marx would do that quite often. It's not this, but that, right? It's not common sense, but this other alternative viewing. It is only in this way that, sorry?
Was that Henry Miller who said that you just read?
Yes, the section about healing the wound, that's on page 93-94 of Henry Miller's book, Time of the Assassins, a study on Rimbaud.
That was the quote within Henry Miller. That was actually Henry Miller saying that.
Yes, okay, so the actual line, this is what Rimbaud's imitators, his detractors failed to see. He was advocating the practice of a new life, union of art and life. And then I jump back to Debord's work. So there isn't a quote in the Miller book, but it does finish with a union between art and life, bridging the schism, healing the mortal wound. And that's the end of the passage from Henry Miller. It's quite beautiful because what is important for us is, again, this notion of reconciling art and life together. This is something that really is a great concern for the SI, especially in the first few years of its existence. It kind of informs the Letterist International as well. And what happens is it gets taken further. But Rimbaud himself expressed that possibility. Henry Miller, as early as 1945, identified it and said, this is something that is important. And so it all becomes part of that fabric in which the SI exists. Because again, I want to stress that, they didn't exist in a vacuum. They really were responding to many things that were going on. And it's just quite remarkable when we read these things. Yeah, it's in the air, right? It's kind of in the air. It's what others are thinking about. Now, what is important is how we're going to put revolution at the service of poetry. And it's only, and this is Debord on page 151, it is only in this way that revolution does not betray its own project. We don't intend to repeat the mistakes of the surrealists who put themselves at the service of the revolution right when it had ceased to exist. Bound to the memory of a partial and rapidly crushed revolution, surrealism rapidly turned into a reformist of the spectacle, a critique of a certain form of the reigning spectacle that was carried out from within the dominant organization of that spectacle. So Paishini, to your point, there they are. So Debord already sees that there were clearly, so there was an impasse that would be reached by any kind of group that tried to do a similar thing. They were trying to figure out some new, again, the Northwest Passage is what they called it, but some new way out of this this inability to express authentically, which is not always possible, but certainly is valuable and worth trying. So that's on page 151 of De Beau's essay. The surrealists seem to have overlooked the fact that every internal improvement or modernization of the spectacle is translated by power into its own encoded language, to which it alone holds the key. So those that control culture and cultural production also control the meaning, ultimately what these products will mean, what those commodities will mean to people. And not in this essay, but in others, De Beau does essentially slam the surrealists for not realizing what was happening. They were being co-opted and they were embracing it because they were still, and Emily, to your point last week, that it's still good to make art, right? They said, oh, you don't want to remove this because we are artists. And so for me, to never be able to compose again, yeah, that would drive me nuts. But we still have to be able to create art, but do it in a way that perhaps is less prone to commodification. Now, I don't say the answer is become Gigi Allen and throw shit at your audience, because guess what? Somebody will still try to sell a t-shirt with that on it. It's just the way it is. But what we need to do is to figure out, is there, again, authentic, quote unquote, a more authentic way to create art or artistic production that does not turn into a commodified thing. So the fact that whatever happens to the spectacle, it's constantly improving and modernizing, becoming more efficient, less critical, more lethal at times, but it continues to co-opt whatever resistance is presented to it. And it's a tall order. It's not easy to do. And this is one of the reasons why by the early 70s, they gave up, because they had taken it as far as they could. There was also, again, in the early 70s, the increasing radicalization of these groups, using guns and bombs and murder and kidnapping, which De Beau was more than aware of. In fact, a few of his friends that he thought were not involved in this kind of thing, in fact, were. So yeah, there was a fear of being arrested. So there's a time and a place for all these things, but certainly at this particular early time in 63, he's very much aware that the spectacle is owned by someone, it's controlled by someone, it's now disseminated through culture, and therein lies, that's what we need to do. If you remember the movie Hackers, got to hack into the mainframe, right? Well, they're kind of doing that, right? Hack into a different kind of mainframe, but that's essentially what they are articulating, but there's no mainframe yet, right? There's no telematics, but certainly those ideas are there this early, and they continue to be there because we haven't resolved it. And I still think, when you look at Dada and surrealism, they grew out of war and post-war periods. Well, in my lifetime, I've seen very few years where there hasn't been war. So to me, those themes are perennial, right? Because we continue to live in the world that created surrealism and Dada in the first place, we continue to relive these experiences of war and post-war environments. They still have meaning to some degree. And there's nothing wrong with going back to see, okay, what initially, provoked this artistic response? What did they do with it? How far did they get? And this is what the SI are doing. They point out the original ideas, but they're also willing to say, look, it didn't work because of this, right? It was eventually co-opted. It was then now becoming part of a different spectacle, or at least an extended view of the spectacle itself. So he carries on 51-52. Every revolution has been born in poetry. The first of all had been made in the force of the poetry. This phenomenon continues to escape theorists of revolution. Indeed, it cannot be understood if one still clings to the old conception of revolution or of poetry. It has been generally sensed by counter-revolutionaries. Poetry terrifies them. Real poetry, which has world enough in time, seeks to reorient the entire world and the entire future to its own ends. So once again, the ability to use, yes, very much a Northwest Passage, which is, it's this image that continually gets re-articulated in various ways, but ultimately underlining it is the same idea, this desire to sort of to get out from this aporia, if you're being philosophical, or that impasse. Emily.
I don't actually know the original context of the Northwest Passage completely, but isn't it like to find a faster route to get to the new world, to basically just like exploit North America more? Like, I actually don't know, so this is as a question, but doesn't Northwest Passage come from the age of discovery and trying to find a faster way? Or maybe it wasn't to get to North America, maybe it was to get to China. Like the Northwest Passage was supposed to get you
Yeah.
faster to be able to take spices and opium and etc.
Yes, you're right. It was a second one. It was a shorter distance to travel from, essentially from west to east. Because when you think about it, if you were to travel to China, you would have to either go around South America, or the opposite way around Africa, which would be even longer. So it was a desire to connect west and east in a more efficient manner. But you're also right the first time about to sell goods. It wasn't like so we can travel. We can live. No, it was to just get there sooner. And of course, these were trading routes, because at the time these things were looked for. Trading routes were the mainstay, right? The main interest in any kind of exploration. So yes, it was actually to connect west and east together, and to travel through a part of the world that was pretty hostile, and it wasn't successfully done. Whether people are still looking for it, I don't know. But you're right. It was both for commodities, and secondly to connect west and east together.
So it's a strange metaphor then, but I mean, I don't know what else to say about that. I wanted to say, I was watching this documentary last night actually about Wordsworth and Coleridge.
Mhm.
And it was talking about how I guess I didn't know much about their history, but they lived in, at least Wordsworth lived in Paris, and he had to leave because during the terror, he was English. And so he was worried basically about, because they still had a kind of monarchy of being killed basically as being English and whatever. So he goes back to England and he becomes friends with Coleridge, who is lecturing there a lot. And of course, they're both poets as well as writing theory. And they basically buy a house together, or they decide to live in this house together that's out in kind of the English countryside, and they start writing poetry together. And this is where they write The Rime of the Ancient Mariner and all the other things that make up that book that they write together, which they write interestingly anonymously, or people know they write it, but they don't want to put their names on it, which like appeals to kind of my thoughts about writing poetry. I like the anonymous idea.
Mm-hmm.
Anyways, they were spied on for a lot of the time. The English crown had agents who were undercover and like lived around the house to spy on them and be like,
Really interesting.
Yeah, what are they doing? Because they were perceived to be such radicals. And I think that's really interesting. Like they knew they were writing poetry, but at the same time, it was a big enough deal that they were basically surveilled this whole entire time. And so I just wonder, like in the context of this class, if we think that that would even happen at all, really, in today's context, or what does it look like to be that kind of a figure in today's society? Because of course we're all like micro surveilled all the time, but it's hard to imagine like today, a couple poets in the countryside, basically, being watched because their poetry might be too radical actually for England itself to be able to handle. So it's just interesting to think about that they were taking that seriously. It's hard not to romanticize, at least on my part, because it's hard to see that kind of thing happening today. But I would say there are contemporary artists who have kind of crossed that threshold as well. But usually it's because they're engaged also at the same time in explicit activism, like actually, actually,
which makes that
writing poetry.
Yeah. No, you're right. So if the poet is engaged in direct action, for example, that makes them someone that is probably worthy of surveillance, probably more so the direct action part than the poetry. But at least for me, I mean, I was a kid at the time, but I've read lots of books about, rock stars in the 60s, because rock music was this subversive force in America in the 1960s. And it was particularly subversive because you've got the Vietnam War, you've got civil rights, you've got just basically civil unrest, and you have artists that were willing to put their career on the line to sing about it. These days, I wouldn't. I mean, the Iraq War, I remember like, oh, I'm against the Iraq War, but whatever they want to do, it's okay with me. Wow, does that fence post really go all the way up your butt or what? Like it's just, never taking a side. Now, having said that, in the 1960s, there was a lot at stake. right? There was an awful lot of serious issues that were happening. Not to say what's happening today isn't, but particularly important in the US. And the view from the FBI, for example, was that people like the Jefferson Airplane and Jimi Hendrix and the Grateful Dead and other artists that were really respected by their artists, by their fans, really listened to what they had to say. And so those folks were surveyed big time. John Lennon writes about it in his books, being surveyed, and it took him forever to get a green card. And then when he finally gets one, they embrace him like, oh, you're a true poet and freedom fighter. It's like, yeah, it took me 8 years to get this damn thing. So not now. I personally cannot think of someone that would be that would fit that category, but certainly in the 1960s, because there were serious issues that were happening in the US, those people singing about it out loud and being noticed and being respected, that made them really dangerous. Maxwell.
Just to throw in an option, Ai Weiwei might be an example of a creative mind or an artist that has garnered this kind of attention, but not from the West. I can't think of anyone from the West that gets that attention.
Now, there's a Chinese artist whose name escapes me, if one of you may know, who's been watched by the Chinese government repeatedly now over the last, probably the last 10 years. And thank you. Ai Weiwei, I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly. Yes. Now I don't believe engages in direct action, but there's something about his work that the Chinese government are really concerned with. And, I don't think he's been imprisoned, but he certainly has been detained, which is a nice sort of a euphemism for imprisoned.
Yeah, no, he has basically been imprisoned and under surveillance. That's who Maxwell was talking about.
Okay.
And, maybe Maxwell, you want to say more? I don't know. He really looks into corruption, right? So there was all those elementary schools that were falling down and killing shit tons of children because they were basically built terribly by the Chinese government. And he did a lot of work around that got a lot of attention, but I don't know if it was that caused him to be was he on house arrest or actually in Chinese prison?
I think house arrest for a long time.
I think he's been in both.
Okay.
Now, I know at one point there was his work has traveled around the world. And I remember my aunt giving me shit for going to see the David Bowie exhibition at the AGO. How dare you, she said, when this guy who's done so much more, his thing is going. I said, Aunt Josie, I promise I'm going to go after. It was gone by the time I had time, but I mean, there it is. But again, I don't want to make light of it. This is very serious. Emily, as you pointed out, this has happened in the past, happened in the 60s. It still occurs today, but it seems to be that it's that secondary behavior. It is what else these people are doing, especially if they're exposing corruption. Anytime that happens, I have the most tremendous head of priorities. There you go. Okay, the Bowie thing was pretty cool though. And so what's happening now is certain people get watched for partly their art, but it seems to be their ability, one, to take a stand, right, to be that lone wolf and speak out, and secondly, it depends on what it is that they are describing. Like I say, corruption is one of the. I think it's, if you look at all the demonstrations around the world, many of them are about corruption. It's a chronic rot. It's a cancer that metastasizes around the world. And when those people point that out, those that benefit from that corruption are the first one to scream out loud. Maxwell.
Payashini had her hand up first.
Oh, okay. Go ahead.
No, I just wanted to say that since we were talking about examples from outside the West, the things happening in India since there's a majoritarian government, you must have heard of it. But the things that happen with, just the paranoia around resistance is so insane that in multiple cases across the years, people who are completely innocent and completely disengaged from political affairs, political matters, have been roped in to be accused of something, and that in turn has led them to become figures of radical resistance to the government. Yeah.
Wow.
And so there's a very I mean, it's the largest party in, I mean, India is a really large country, but then on top of that, this particular government is the largest political party in the world, and it has a lot of money and a lot of people. So basically what they do is that if anyone speaks in favor of something that is, that is against government agendas, those people are either harassed online. I mean, it happens everywhere.
Hmm.
But the interesting thing is how people who are so distant from this whole context are accused of so many things. For instance, Greta Thunberg recently spoke in favor of farmer resistance. And I think there's been a case filed against her in India, which is completely absurd. Even legally does not make any sense, but that actually happened.
Yeah.
So, and then Rihanna spoke about this particular thing. So now there's this rumor doing rounds that there's an international conspiracy to overthrow the Indian state, and Rihanna and Greta Thunberg are a part of that.
Wow. I think a couple of weeks ago, I think I mentioned to a friend to say, hey, I wonder how often we're going to hear the word fake news over the next few years. I think it's alive and well, and it's migrated. It's gone elsewhere. But it's true. The moment you start painting someone with a brush like that, it becomes difficult to sort of cleanse yourself, especially when you're in the public eye. Once that charge is brought against you, it's just that much more work to say, no, I'm innocent, because the belief is that, well, the police always get the right person eventually. So yes, that is very, very difficult. And as we were talking, I was listening, I thought of another artist also from the East, Pussy Riot, right? It's another group that has gone through the same thing. And again, it was partly because they are performers and they are known, and they're known around the world, but they were doing this sort of very carnivalesque thing in a church. And of course it rubbed the officials the wrong way. So yes, I think it doesn't happen so much in the US anymore, in North America, because artists seem to, I don't know, they try to not sound political, and they are doing a really good job of it, actually, because I can't tell you, Adam Levine, what side of the fence he's on. Do I care? No. But there are some artists that, that are more underground, that are more explicit. They are going to push that agenda because it is an audience that's in the know, right? And and if and again, the rap world began that way, right? It was trying to represent what was happening on the street, brought it to the mainstream. But there are certainly other scenes that are the same way. I don't know if punk rock is as political as it was in the late 70s and early 80s. It was in the early 80s in the US, because they were fighting against Reaganism, Dead Kennedys, and bands like that, the really good ones. But it seems to kind of quieten down. But we see the same kind of ideas that are being discussed here, right? That kind of surveillance that poets in the 1880s may have gone through, still happening. I think it will continue to happen. As soon as that message is understood for what it really means, right? To be détourned, as the SI say, the fact that it is now sort of highlighting something else. And we can read into that behavior something that is more deeper and more sinister. That's when those messages are going to be either curtailed or silenced. So we need to be very, very careful of that. I had a few other things here, and I've noticed we're already 11:15, but I wanted to just point out a couple of things with Rimbaud. Baudelaire, for the most part, was an individualist. He looked at revolution as ultimately sort of very sacrificial. All you lose is innocence, and it's a slaughter bench. And in that sense, he would have agreed with Hegel, right? One of these lines from Philosophy of History that really struck out at me, that history is just a slaughter bench. Baudelaire looked at the revolution the same way. On the other hand, someone else like Rimbaud, living just slightly after the fact, his we'll call it his social consciousness was much stronger. And he certainly had a very different view of the worker, a different view of social reality. And even at a very young age, because he's writing these things in his late teens, early 20s, which in itself is remarkable. But Rimbaud, right, considers the problem of the poet in literature, which is, again, another serious issue, as well as in society. And quote from The Blacksmith, and find this words, page 21. I got everything all lined up here. So he writes, for example, in one poem, a very early one called The Blacksmith, He writes, we are workers, king workers. We're the ones made for the time to come, the new day dawning, when man will work his forge from dusk to dawn, seeker after great causes, great effects, when he will finally bend all things to his will and mount existence as he mounts a horse. Okay, well, last side's a little odd, but I kind of see what he means, right? In other words, take control of existence and harness it, right? Harness it for what it can potentially do. So here it is, right? We are workers. Whenever Baudelaire talks about workers, it's very derogatory. These guys are all writing around the time. I don't know if you've ever read any Kierkegaard or Marx from 1844, but he talks about both of them, the masses, right? The massy masses, as Marx would call them, just basically people with, that were primed for lowest common denominator entertainment, right? Just entertainment to while away the hours. Don't give me, pedagogical information or education, just entertain me. And yet here's Rimbaud in the form of a poem talking about, yeah, we're workers, that new day is coming, all right? We will forge from dawn to dusk, seeker of great efforts and so on. So he's very much aware that the worker has something to say and something to do in the development of this new world. Now, remember, anarchism as an idea has not come into being officially, there isn't a word for it yet, but certainly those kinds of ideas are there. So, and again, I'm just going through my notes here. The transformation of the expression of this revolutionary spirit undergoes between metrical poems, which are, with few exceptions, immature productions, like the early stuff, prose poems, but he just continues to work. And we can at least say that Rimbaud would have been himself a socialist. Revolution for Rimbaud was not a means, but it was a means for total realization of self. There's another SI idea. Now, the symbolists, generally speaking, were about, I don't want to call it rugged individualism because we sound like, I'm going to go and explore the West and make lots of money. Not that kind. Rugged individualism in the sense of self-realizing, right? Self-sufficient beings, self-realizing beings, those that are able to make a name for themselves to the best degree they can in the world. But here Rimbaud is thinking, okay, I can do that, but so can everyone else, right? Revolution is a means for total realization of self. If the means fail, as it did the commune, he would try another. He refused to subordinate his whole life to revolution, to run the risk of failing as he had the revolt. Because remember, he was there. Yes, I think Nietzsche exists at the time he does and says the things that he does because these ideas are in place. Now, I can reach back here and I've got a 2-volume set of Nietzsche in French. Why? Not because I'm going to torture myself, but because there's this amazing index at the back that goes through every single word and it tells you exactly where he finds him. So I looked up Rimbaud, looked up Baudelaire is mentioned once in 2,000 pages that he wrote as a kind of individual. So Nietzsche, I think, takes this idea that exists in symbolist poetry, although he didn't write poetry, but really liked this particular characterization of strong individuals. Now, Baudelaire is talked about very briefly by Nietzsche, no mention of Rimbaud, no mention of Marx. Marx is not mentioned anywhere. So Nietzsche is about the self-starter, right? The self-sufficient being. Certainly that's not new, but I think it comes from there. I think it comes from articulations by Baudelaire and those that thought the same way, that total realization of self is for sure a Nietzschean idea. And Rimbaud himself was involved in the 1871 Paris Commune revolt for a short time. Luckily, he wasn't killed because he managed to leave early enough. But he really looked at the worker as that vehicle that would make that change happen. So the same inspiration in worker and city and cities. I'll just very quickly get to it here because we're running out of time. Give me my notes. Yes, okay. So 260. Okay, so here is this is Rimbaud describing in the poem City. I am a temporary and not at all discontented citizen of a metropolis considered modern because all known tastes have been eluded in the furnishings and the outsides of the houses, as well as in the plan of the city. Morals and language have been reduced to their simplest expression. That is all. That's Debord. That's the all the king's men, saying essentially the same thing, right? Morals and language have been reduced to the simplest expression, that is all. And this notion that the massy masses, as Marx would call them, as language continually gets dumbed down, this is something that they just enjoy, right? They don't, I just want to park my ass in front of the TV and just watch, something. I don't want to think, said virtually everybody that watches cable TV these days. No offense if any of you do, but I'm being a caricaturist. But this notion of morals and language have been reduced to the simplest expressions. That is all, right? Entertainment reduced to its simplest expression. Language, communication, interaction, all of these things are watering down. And there's Rimbaud writing about it as a young person in 1870, full 100 years before the SI pick up on the same theme. And it carries on. And from my window, what original specters roll through the thick, eternal smoke. So not a big fan of industrialization. So that's the poem City. And then in Cities 2, another one, this isn't like a follow-up, but it's there's two of them, 1 and 2. Again, Cities 2, the official Acropolis outdoes the most colossal conceits of modern barbarity. How can I describe the dull daylight of unchanging gray skies, the imperial effects of these buildings, the eternally snow-covered ground? He goes on, the arrangements of buildings and squares, courts and covered terraces. They have done away with hacks and cabs. The parks, for example, of primitive nature, ornamented with marvelous art. For the stranger in our time, recognition is impossible. The commercial quarter is a circus in a single style with galleries and arcades, right? Recognition is impossible. So again, an awareness that what's reflected back to Rimbaud is not really what's going on, right? Now this is also the beginning of mass media, right? There isn't just the masses, but they're being spoon-fed mass media. So advertising becomes really important at this point in selling the products that we can now produce in greater numbers through industrialization. So we have a clear awareness that things aren't quite right. And then another one, Metropolitan, fleeing out of the bituminous waste en route through sheets of mist rising in terrible bands to the hovering sky, high, then low, full of the blackest, most sinister smoke of a morning ocean. Spelt morning as in, dying in mourning. Morning ocean, rolled helmets, wheel, wagons, and horse flanks. This is battle. So there's a combative spirit that Debord would have embraced in looking at this one like, this is wrong, right? What are we going to do? So for me, at least, as much as the symbolist poets don't directly influence the SI, I think there are echoes in their work that we can find their genesis, right? Their origins in symbolic poetry or symbolist poetry from Rimbaud, I think more so than Baudelaire, because Rimbaud, I think, is more aligned with that notion of, revolution of self. Baudelaire, by the time he dies in 1867, he hasn't even seen the 1871 massacre, but he's lived through 1848, 1849, 1844. He's getting tired, right? He's getting old, he's getting tired, and he's going like, how much instability can one person take? So his view of revolution is very disconcerting because he simply thinks that all that's going to be left is just bloodshed, right? It's not amounting to anything. And any utopian vision that you have of this, this better world is just that. It's a utopia. So I just wanted to point them out. One thing too, that when you look up in a dictionary, and Debord would rise from the dead and slap me in the head for doing this, but one of the definitions of revolution is what? A complete movement back to the originary point. Like one revolution of a wheel, right? Is right back to where we started. That would be the Baudelaire version. In fact, we're not only back to our point of origin, we're probably worse off because now there's more police surveillance, there's more crackdowns, there's more whatever. So we have to be really careful as how we harness utopia to that revolutionary spirit. But certainly it's there. Now, the last thing I wanted to point out is some other information I found here on the distinction between anarchism and sort of revolutionary thought and the way in which it lines up with symbolist thought. So symbolists were certainly the avant-garde in the arts. We wonder, however, whether the social view was as progressive as we often assumed, although there's evidence of certain radical leanings, such as what I pointed out. Now, The word actually doesn't come into play till about the 1870s. Now, Emily, correct me if I'm wrong in terms of the history of anarchist thought. Now, this is coming from, again, my room full of books. These two books here, I don't know if you can see them, Le Mouvement Anarchiste en France and the Mouvement Anarchiste, there's 2 volumes. Now, unfortunately, and again, they're pretty thick. They're not available in English. They are excellent books, but the main idea that's presented in the beginning is sort of anarchism is a recognizable thing, really kind of comes into being around 1870s. Of course, the arguments between Marx and Bakunin, for example, sort of established this other field. But at this point, we have symbolist poets that are really interested in this idea, because at that time, anarchist ideology and symbolist aesthetics were the standard diet that most of avant-garde intellectuals were feeding on. Proudhon, the so-called father of anarchism, this again coming from this book, I can stand to be corrected. He described it as a social organization based on collective ownership and free agreement. He defined anarchism as a theory that authority is evil. So anything that weakens its power in order to promote more liberty is good. So while authoritarian socialists, followers of Marx, see the root of social ills in the principle of private ownership and the means of production, libertarian socialists or anarchists find it in the principle of authority itself, the authority that is realized in and through the spectacle, in and through culture, in and through law, law and order, because ultimately that's where they really make a big difference. So this is kind of sort of sections out of this book and sort of going through it really quickly. So the negative tenets of the anarchist doctrine could thus be summed up as a destruction of the 3 heads of the authoritarian hydra: state, capital, and religion. So the positive principle of anarchism, on the other hand, took the form of relentless struggles for more freedom and well-being for the individual. In that sense, anarchism can reflect some of these Baudelairean ideas that we see in his work about the individual really being the one that will make a difference. As I'm saying this, I'm going to try to find quickly the one passage here which underline, because he essentially is saying that really only the individual is able to do this. Okay, this is Baudelaire, My Heart Lay Bare. For the law of progress to exist, everyone would have to create it. That is, when every individual will apply himself to progress, then and only then will humanity be in a state of progress. This hypothesis can serve to explain the identity of 2 contradictory ideals, liberty and fatality. Not only will there be, in the case of progress, an identity between freedom and fatality, but this identity has always existed. This identity is history, the history of nations and of individuals. So there is a real key phrase here, like basically the individual is going to make that difference. That's different from Rimbaud that says, the group, the massy masses, right? The workers' movements, they're the ones that are going to make the difference. So even though they're both symbolist poets, there's a very clear difference between the way these individuals are thinking. Now, a gentleman I'd never heard of before, Pierre Kropotkin, I believe I'm saying his name correctly. This is another individual that is mentioned in this book. He believed that industrialization would benefit the entire human community. Another SI thought, right, that technology is good. Now, when I looked him up, holy cow, anarchist, socialist, economist, sociologist, historian, political scientist, human geographer. Man, this guy did it all. How many hats was he wearing? But human geography, that's psychogeography. Go ahead.
He's a little bit like the anarchist Buddha in a way, because he was a prince in Russia, like a sort of royalty, right? And then he left the royalty to commit himself to the anarchist cause and do all this stuff that you're talking about. So I always think of him as being like the Buddha. Although to be fair, a lot of Russian intellectuals at that time were aristocracy and kind of shun it. But yeah, I think of him as Buddha.
Well, yeah, I mean, like I say, I hadn't heard him until I started reading this book, but the one that really stuck out to me is human geographer. So again, the notion of psychogeography, the notion of dérive, I'm going to look up, I was able to find online the Words of Men, I think it's called. There's maybe that one of his better books. It's in my hard drive. I'm just pointing here, my hard drive on my laptop. I'm going to look it up. But that notion of a human geographer to me sounds like psychogeography in dérive, right? That intuitive awareness, that deep, authentic awareness of where you are, right? You're not in a non-place like Marc Roger was talking about. You're in a real place, right? You're in an authentic place. So these individuals, Kropotkin, right, saw the artist, like the worker, as a victim of conditions prevailing in a capitalist society, either a victim of the markets manipulated by the middleman or the state, for whose meager subsidy he was forced to relinquish all originality and independence. Well, Baudelaire would go, yep, that's me. So there's a lot of overlap with all these different thinkers. So very much in the air, but we have to be careful also too to say, you know, we can't paint them with a broad brush. We need to be able to make those distinctions, because certainly Baudelaire versus Rimbaud in terms of revolution is different. But we have thinkers that are presenting to us ideas that really find their articulation, you know, the most poetic, of course, in the poetry of the symbolists. So it just kind of goes on here, and I'm going to be very quick because it's already 11:30. Now, so politically, the period 1892 to 1894, which is the one we're talking about here, characterized by disgust with corruption in government. Surprise. During the same period, symbolism could be seen as an expression of revolt in literature, revolt against the remnants of classical prosody, which is basically articulation, against the platitudes of realism and naturalism, against positivistic complacency, and a too static a view of humanity and of the world. Symbolists were just as extreme in their individualism as were the anarchists. They maintained no real existence other than the idea that the individual entertains of it. So now we're going all the way back to our first initial idea of what symbolism is, which is clothing a primordial idea like truth or justice or beauty or freedom or whatever in that contingent language. And so we have this idea that, you know, only what matters to the individual, sounds like Nietzsche as well, right? Other than the idea that the individual entertains of it. So again, I'm kind of scanning through, but I just made a bunch of notes that really sort of paint a rather remarkable picture of that relationship between symbolist poetry that only is articulated as a thing in the late 1880s, and yet coming around the same time is the beginnings in the articulation of what anarchism is, right? Self-management, the fact that, you know, technology is a good thing. And so all of that gets kind of imported and echoed in some of the work of the SI. But again, we need to be careful that we articulate exactly who does what, because not all of them are thinking the same way. So it was just really remarkable as I did my readings that there was a lot that was going on with the symbolists, that we can at least say, okay, there were some ideas that were at work there that we need to consider in at least entertaining the notion that Debord knew about Rimbaud and Baudelaire, that's for sure, because he mentions them, but what they did with it, because they were always the first to point out, you know, serious shortcomings or aporias or whatever you want to call them in some of their strategies. That's when they come in and go, okay, how can we still create something without being co-opted? And that's really the $64,000 question, because it's not easy, right? It's not easy to be co-opted in some way or another. The last article here by Mustafa Kayati, 1966, Captive Words, kind of reiterates the same idea, but even a few years later. Phone again, I'm going to ignore it if you can hear it. Again, the very first lines: popular assumptions due to what they conceal work for the dominant organization of life. Every critique of the old world has been made in the language of that world, yet directed against it, and therefore automatically in a different language. Every revolutionary theory has had to invent its own terms to destroy the dominant sense of other terms and establish new meanings in the world of meanings, corresponding to the new embryonic reality needing to be liberated from the dominant trash heap. Another nice zinger. A definition is always open, never definite. Ours have a historical value that are applicable during a specific period linked to a specific historical practice. So there is a notion that what Debord presented to us back in 1963 about the dominant organization of life and the language that informs that dominant organization, and then a clear awareness of the historical conditions that they find themselves in at that time in order to affect a change that will not end up with co-opting and commodification, They're very well aware of what the Dada and Surrealism went through, and don't knock it because it was a complete waste of time. They're learning from it. So their criticisms are constructive, but they want to make sure they don't go down the same path. So Captive Words talks about, to me at least, the same sort of ideas. And this is the first couple of paragraphs on page 222. I'll just read the last one. It is impossible to get rid of a world without getting rid of the language that conceals and protects it, without laying bare its true nature. As the social truth of power is permanently falsification, language is its permanent guarantee, and the dictionary its universal reference. So dictionary terms already done, already fixed. All right, there's no wiggle room in and out. That's not good. So every revolutionary praxis has felt the need for a new semantic field for expressing a new truth. Then he goes on at the bottom, because language is the house of power. That's going to be the title of my new book. The language is the house of power, the refuge of its police violence. Any dialogue with power is violence, whether passively suffered or actively provoked. When power wants to avoid resorting to its material arms, it relies on language to guard the oppressive order. So there's clearly an understanding of language functioning as a kind of bulwark against this, the capitalist society, locking in meaning to words only meaning that. And of course, the word terrorist, right? The word terrorist. Chomsky's written about it. I haven't read it for a long time or looked at it for a long time, but just the word terrorist. That's a really good example. And I use that because just a couple months ago, one of the last lessons in my Ethics and Society course at Fanshawe, we talk about the use of state-sponsored torture on terror suspects. It's usually 50-50. And I like the students that believe it's a good thing to explain why they think so. Well, but they're terrorists. I said, okay, and I hear them out and say, think of this. The very people inflicting harm and torture upon you get to define who a terrorist is. They just kind of stop and go, let me rephrase that. So the point I'm getting at is right now, like we were talking about, we're not having the police survey, poets and the order of things. Yes, okay. That one I haven't looked at, but I know his thoughts on terrorism. But I think here they work because when you control the discourse, right, the public flow of information, you're the one that gets to align, ideas and words together. So when you are now going to give up, in the case of my students that think torture is just fine, that you're also giving to the same people the right to paint anyone with that same statement. So those that are fighting for clean water on indigenous land, First Nations individuals, oh, look, they're terrorists all of a sudden. Interesting. So that's the point that I raised to them. I'd say, look, I'm not going to say that you're wrong, but I'd like you to think about that. And because it's something that you have not probably thought about, because you're the one identifying terrorists as being a certain group of individuals. But I think that kind of idea is what was going through Debord's mind when he was, Kayati as well from Tunisia, was thinking the same thing, that the words that are used to define who we are, if they're owned by someone else, we can suffer. I think that's one of the reasons why the Frankfurt School, Adorno was really thinking about, yeah, exactly, the Proud Boys, right? The Proud Boys are now a terror group. And so when you control that ability to designate, that's a lot of power. Because really, let's face it, most people don't even stop to think, is this terror label appropriate? We already see there maybe some civil rights issues that are behind that. But when you control the ability to designate a word to a certain group of people, that is wielding an awful lot of power. And I think that may be explaining in a very simple way what Adorno, felt non-identity theory was one of the ways around it, right? One of the ways to sort of skirt that issue of being identified. Of course, as a German Jew, absolutely. But I think it works even now. And it works even now to be really careful that you give to the powers that be that ability to designate. They may only words, right? They may only be words, but they could be very powerful words. And I think that is what Kayati says in his essay, Captive Words, the fact that there is a meaning that's now been, congealed around that particular term. And that term now gets designated to more and more people. Because if you want to be able to behave the same way to all terrorists, yeah, paint anybody that points out corruption, that he's a reckless jaywalker, he must be a terrorist, and you're gone. So I'm going to end with that because I think we've got at least a couple of new ideas that we can look at and go, yeah, it's still going on. But certainly the word terrorist is, for me, the one that is the most dangerous. And Paishini, I think probably the same thing is happening in India, where we have, it's an international cabal. Like, really? The same kind of thing is happening. Maybe not fake news, but I think the word terrorist is much more loaded because it's one that pushes buttons for people, right? And let's face it, the ones whose buttons are being pushed tend to be the ones that don't think critically and ask themselves, well, why would that be? Why would somebody that is, protesting for clean water, right? For literally just clean water, for a chance to live, be a terrorist? So how does that work? Well, we've labeled them such. End of discussion. So yeah, the pushback is necessary and ongoing. Okay, thank you so much. I thought that one was pretty structured. I had my notes here all ready to go. I don't know if you want me to post what I've got here, if you want to take a quick look at it, because I literally went through half of it because I'm always Mr. Overprepared. Okay, let me just sort of clean it up and then I'll post it. And it just basically, it's a summary of the 3 articles I asked you to look at. We didn't have a chance to look at Mechanik's book, but there we go. This one here, again, translated, still not translated, but the intro is. The French history, this one here. Yeah, okay, so this is, okay, so there is the first one. So the anarchist movement in France. So from its origins to 1914, and then the second one here, same author, 1914 to today. And today, this was written in 1975. Right, lots going on in 60s and 70s in France. Crazy place to be. But yeah, I couldn't find it in English, so I thought, okay, fine. And I forget where I came across it, but I don't know if I'm like you guys, like a bloodhound for footnotes, but I kind of dig away at those footnotes. And the end result is that, usually some pretty interesting stuff. Okay, we will not be meeting next week. Is that correct? You guys have official reading week, we'll call it. And so the short essays will be due not this Sunday, but the following Sunday, the 22nd, giving you at least that break to work on it and sort of formulate some things. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a look. We have essentially, I think 7 people almost all the time. And I'm going to see if we can sort of have one person present from between now and when the essay is due. We might have to overlap a little bit, but let me see our schedule for the remainder, because I want to have everyone be able to present and also be able to answer questions. And a couple of times, I know in the classroom, the presentation may have been 20 minutes, but the discussion went on for quite some time and it was all very beneficial. So ideally, I would like everyone to have a chance to present sort of one per week. So we'll aim for that. But in the meantime, just sort of work through some ideas. And again, they don't need to be, perfectly structured. Just sort of, I'm going to pursue this. Here are some other books I want to take a look at, but kind of sort of have it in a somewhat shaped version. And then between that time and being able to present it, you'll have a chance to sort of keep working on it. Usually
Is there a word limit for the essay, for the first essay?
I'm looking at, I think if I said 5 to 7 pages maximum, I mean, that's a lot.
Okay.
But I think if you can sort of summarize it in maybe 4 pages, because like in this case, I don't know how many pages this thing was, but I started talking and we had questions and so on. Let's say let's make it 4 or 5 maximum and have that
and do you want us to get the topic approved? Or
no, I think all of you probably can sort of combine your personal interest, your background, whether it's philosophy, art, or other, or English, and then I will leave it up to you. Now, having said that, if you are not quite sure, please do contact me and email me, and we can sort of shape it together and say, this looks viable. Maxwell.
So just to clarify, it's 4 to 5 pages for the short paper?
Correct, yeah. And that can include a works cited page as well. If you want to go beyond it, if you feel that you're kind of, on a roll, by all means do continue, because the total, like the last final version will be about 15 pages. So certainly if you find that you can write 7 and you're really happy with it, that's perfectly fine. I'd like to give people some, some leeway, because if you're still kind of thinking through it and you just have some ideas, and then of course now you got to hand it in, I would say 4 to 5 would be probably adequate enough to give you a good idea of what you want to work on. But again, I leave it open to you to work a little bit more if you think it's worthwhile, or you're kind of on a roll. Because what I do is I think for months, and then I just vomit it all out. Then I reshape it into something real nice. But that's the way I work, and that doesn't mean everybody works the same way. But I think 4 or 5 pages would be enough to give you a pretty good idea of what you want to discuss, and then sort of a tentative works cited page. And so just contact me during the break. I'm not going anywhere. In fact, probably not even leaving this room. But if you have any questions, just run them by me, and then maybe we can sort of shape it in the sense that I can say, hey, look at this particular essay, which we haven't talked about, but may help you in formulating some ideas. So stay in touch, not going anywhere. But in the meantime, start thinking about kind of formulating something, but the door's always open. So just fire off a quick email for confirmation, or, do you think this is something that could be fleshed out in 15 pages, and we'll go from there. But I will leave it up to you to come up with your own topics. Does that sound fair? That's total freedom. Okay. Excellent. Many likes. A few cares. Okay. Anyway, have a wonderful week and a half off. There you go. Have a wonderful week off. I'm going to miss this. I'm going to stare at the wall for a couple hours next Thursday. And hopefully you have a chance to sort of, bring some of these ideas that we've talked about. We've said a lot of things, kind of bring them into some kind of a shape that is doable. Again, the maximum will be 15, 18 maximum pages. It doesn't have to be a tome or a chapter, because I know, Judith, you've got a lot on your plate. Oh, which reminds me, I don't know if you've ever seen these 2 books. One is Dictionary of Critical Theory, and the other one is Literary Theory. Super useful. They are so helpful. So those can help you to kind of condense all that information, because that blackboard still haunts me. Way too many words on it. So good luck. All right. Have a wonderful week. I'm going to post this video as well, like I have with the other ones. And then we'll meet again in a couple of weeks. And in the meantime, I'll look to see if we can structure 1 presentation per week. I believe we can. I think that's doable. So in the meantime, take care, and we'll see each other in 2 weeks. Bye-bye.